Hello, everyone. So we are going to do some live coding here with the task update exercise. Hopefully nothing blows up, but then you'll be here to save the day, hopefully. Okay, so let's start right off. So a little bit of a refresher for you guys. So for those who weren't following from yesterday, right now our app as it is, when you open, like you have boards, you can create new boards. And when you open a board, this is the UI that you are greeted with, right? Then you can create tasks, you can create columns, and so on. What we want to do is when you click on one of these cards, so one of these tasks, we want to display the task details on top of the board in a modal dialog, right? So let's go back to the page and let's quickly refresh what we did in terms of the Vue router yesterday. So our routes are being generated automatically based on your directory, right? So something similar to how Nuxt operates, but based on your directories and your component names, it will generate the route automatically. This is done by the Vue plugin pages that does this automatically for you. So if you are not using it, you will have to hook it up yourself, and you have to hook up all these things about the Vue router that we are going to do. Anyways, so with that out of the way, let's now discuss what we want to do again. So we want to open a card, and this card should open a modal dialog on top of the board, meaning this component shouldn't go away. So when I do this, it goes away. We don't want to do that for a couple of reasons. First, because in this application, like if you are building a Trello clone or in Trello, you don't really lose access to the board once you open a task, because you might want to go back and open another task, or go back, update another task. So there is a lot of actions going on here. So you want to be able to make this as frictionless as possible for your users in terms of UI and UX. And there is another reason. So notice when I click on a task, the URL changes to the task URL. I think it's a little bit small to see on screen, but the task URL updates. And that's a really important part of this. You want this link to be shareable. So if someone takes this and throws it in a new tab, they should be able to see the exact same task as you. Now, that's what we want to do here, right? So there's multiple ways you can do this. You can do it manually. You can do it with nested routes. There are multiple ways, but we are going to do it with nested routes since it is surprisingly really easy. Now, let's first off check our routes. We have our ports folder. So this will generate the ports URL here. Then we have the bracket ID.vue component. So this component handles whatever is being rendered in ports / some dynamic value, which is this ID. What we want to do is add a task, right? We want to handle the tasks. Let's first, again, check it. So it's / the port ID / tasks / the task ID. This is the route we are looking to generate. Now, we can do this in multiple ways, but you might be inclined to do this at first. So we start off with tasks. Then you create a file and call it, for example, id.vue. So that's another dynamic page, right? And for now, let's just, for the sake of a demo, let's just get some kind of content ready here, something like hello, nothing too serious, right? And let's see what happens here. So you'll notice nothing happens, hello isn't being rendered, and that's mainly because we have a few issues what we did. First of all, you'll check in your console, you'll notice a lot of warnings about that route wasn't matched, meaning that route, it doesn't even can find that route. So that we didn't generate it correctly. That's the first thing. So let's review what we did wrong here. What we did wrong is in boards, we have tasks folder directly. So that means if we do this, let's open a task and let's remove the board ID, right? Now it worked, right? Because we missed including the board ID again, the new folder structure that we created. So let's go back and fix this issue. So to fix that, again, we'll follow the same thing as we did here. We will create another folder with bracket ID. So this is a dynamic parameter. And we'll just move the tasks folder into there. Now, in theory, this should be fine, but there is one more issue to figure out. So let's click here, and again, nothing happens. And notice the warning change here. It says found a duplicate params with name ID for that path. And you notice the path generated is /:ID/tasks/:ID. And that makes sense because both have the same exact identifier, which is a problem because you can't really access it unless it's unique, right? So let's just make the second one for the task a little bit unique by calling it task ID, right? And should reload, and yeah. Okay, so now it works, and we shouldn't see the same warning down there as before. We have a few other warnings, but we'll get to that later. Now, let me start from the beginning to make sure we have a clean state. And yeah, let's see how can we render that. Now, nested routes work in a really interesting way. Sorry if I'm switching too fast between screens. I'm a full screen guy, so I hope that doesn't throw you off. But let's check the documentation for the nested routes. What do they mean? So nested routes are basically the same thing that we did so far with the application routing, right? So if we go back to the drawer component, you'll notice it has a view router somewhere here, right? So whatever the page renders is being placed here. Now, for the nested routes, it's the same thing. You have a bunch of repeated HTML and components and layout around some pages, but only a smaller part of them actually changes. So you want that part to change based on the route, right? And you want to use the view router for that. And a good example in the docs here, which is done through this ASCII diagram, is you have a profile page for a user, and there is two tabs, right? There is a user tab, and there is the profile tab, sorry, and there is the posts tab. And you want to switch between both of them. But you don't want the entire page to reload just because you switched a tab, right? You want just the tab content to change. And this is the whole idea of nested routes. Sorry, I took a little bit of introduction to nested routes, but they are not very often used, but they are very useful in that case. Now, let's see how we are going to make that work. First, you need to make sure you understand correctly who is the parent and who is the child component, right, for nested routes. So in our case, the page for the port page is the parent component, right? This is the parent route, and it wants to render another route within it. So this is what we want to do. We can do this simply by just throwing in another router view tag, and that's pretty much it. That's all you have to do in the boards component. So if I click on a card, notice that the hello gets rendered down there. Again, that's not what quite we want, but at least we got the nested route working. If I click back, it disappears because it's no longer rendering that child route. Okay, so let's go to the component itself and see what we can do here. So what we want to do is display a modal dialog, right, on top of all the UI, and it should display the information about the task. Now, there are a few ways you can do this, but since we are using Kendo UI, we can grab a component real quick. So let's check their dialog components. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, dialogs overview. That overview is fine. We don't really need a complicated example. And their documentation has a lot of live samples and stuff like that, so you can easily get it working. So open dialog, it looks like this, but it will be suitable to our use case. Now, what we want to do is import these components, right? The dialog and the dialog actions bar from this package. So if this package isn't being installed yet, isn't installed in your application, make sure you do. I did that before the demo, so I don't waste a lot of time. So we're going to use TypeScript, and we are using the setup, right? So this is the same import as they have. We don't need the window. We just need the dialog and the dialog actions bar. Now, good practice is we rename those to something to have a prefix, so to let our fellow developers on the project know that these components are not the native HTML components, because there is a native dialog element, so you don't want them confused. Although Vue will render the one that you meant, so if we imported this as dialog, it will render correctly. Okay, so we imported the dialog components, and let's grab the basic HTML here. So this, let's just make sure the casing is right. And now let's inspect what we have here. So they gave us the KDialog component, and there is this actions bar. This actions bar acts as a footer for the model. So you'll have your actions there. So that makes sense. Looks like we need the K button as well. So let's make sure we grab that. And quick search and replace, and that's pretty much what we want to do. Now let's remove some stuff that don't exist. We don't have any click handlers yet, so let's remove those. We don't have a close handler yet, so let's remove that. Our title, let's make it static for now. Let's say hello from nested route. And since this component has a VF on it in the example, that means we will control its visibility using the VF directive. So we give it a Boolean and it displays it or not, depending on what we want. But in our case, we don't really have a condition at the moment. So we can ask that it displays immediately, right? So it will be displayed by default. Right, now let's check what changed in our application. Now, if I click this, the modal appears and the route updates as we see. We didn't change that. Again, that's whatever we had before. But yeah, the modal appears and seems all right. But if we try to close it or interact with it in any way, it doesn't work. So that's what we need to handle next. Now, you might be wondering, should I just maybe create a ref called is open, and it starts off with true by default, right? And import this with from Vue, and then maybe work against that, and let's add some handlers. So on close clicked, for example, we can toggle the ref to false, right? And we can bind that to the event handler here. So add close on close click maybe, and let's make this button as well close it, right? So would that work? Well, it kind of does work, but you'll notice a problem here is that, first of all, it broke completely. Then, since we are in the board, we still have the task ID up there. We still have this portion of the route up there, which is a problem because that's not what the user will see if they copy this URL and open it a new tab. So if I do this, this is what they see, and this is what we see. So that's not quite right. So let's fix that. Let's ditch this whole idea of controlling the visibility on our own, right? And rethink about this again. So this modal is open by default. It appears whenever we enter that route because that's what's being rendered in the router view, in the port component, right? In the port route component, sorry. So what we can do is we can navigate away from that route back into our previous route, and it should disappear, right? So back to its initial state. So we can test that idea. So let's grab the router instance from Vue router. We can do that with the use router composition function. And again, let's try something else. You would be inclined to do this maybe, like router.back, but that's not a good idea, and I will show you why. So first of all, let's close this. Let's go back to the beginning because we messed up the routes thing at the beginning. So we click, we enter here, and so I click this, let's close it. Okay, it works, and the tasks portion /task ID no longer exists, so that's pretty accurate. The user will see what we are seeing just by checking, by visiting that URL. Now, the problem with router.back is it just goes back, right? It just goes back to whatever the previous route was, and that can be an interesting problem. So let's copy this, right, and paste it here in this example page. And if I close it, it goes back outside of your own application. So maybe you don't want that, maybe you want that. It's up to you, basically. There is no right or wrong here. But generally, that's not what you want. So the safest approach is here to navigate away to an explicit route, right? So we'll go to routes / the route ID. Now we are not sure yet how to access that route ID, but let's, for now, just that's what we need. We need to go back to this page, right? To this route. So since we have access to router, Vue router also gives us a similarly named function called useRoute, right? And gives us access to the current active route, and we can use that. So route.params. Now, don't mess it up. You need to access the board ID, which is called ID based on our directory, right? So, okay, it should be auto-updated. Shouldn't need to reload. So if I close, that's fine. Now let's test that issue from before. Okay, now if I close it, I should remain in the same page. And that's what happens. So this is exactly what we wanted to achieve. Now, there are definitely smarter ways to go about this. Maybe you can inspect the history. Not sure if you can do that or not, but you can inspect the history and make sure if they are, and just go back unless they are going to be outside your app. Or you can set something in a Vue store, in a Pinia store, or in a local storage. It doesn't really matter. You can handle this whatever way you want, but this is a general purpose solution that works really well. All right, so now that we got the routes syncing correctly, let's display some things in our model, right? At the moment, it doesn't do anything, so let's display some things. So for the buttons, it's gonna be either close or save, right? This is not the content, and this is not the title. So let's figure these out right now. Now, what we want to do is whenever this card is opened, right? When this is opened, we want to fetch that task. We want to fetch that from our API and display its information right here. So we'll need to grab the Apollo composables from Vue Apollo, right? So use query, and we're gonna query the API. Now, what type of query are we going to write? That's why I like stuff like these. It allows me to quickly figure out what that schema has and what should I do. So we can quickly search if there is a task query. So we have here a bunch of types. We are not interested in that. We are interested in this. So this is a query for the task. We can call it get task, right? And it gets a ID variable, accepts an ID variable, and we can type it like this. So task, then it accepts an ID. You'll see this clearer in Visual Studio Code. I'm just prototyping the query right here. So what do you want to grab of the task object? Let's not be overzealous here and just grab what we need. So we're just interested in the title, maybe description, and probably just the URL, right? That's good enough for a start. That's the query that we want. And let's go back and type it into our GraphQL folder. So from yesterday, we have pretty much a neat organization for our queries. So let's add just another one. So task.query.gql, paste in our query. Pretty much that's it. Then we need to import it. So import get task query from the GraphQL /queries /task.query.gql. Right? Now this is where things could go wrong. So hopefully it doesn't. Okay, so we want to grab some stuff from use query, similar to what we did yesterday with the board page right here. Right? So something similar to this. We can actually copy it and use it immediately, but I prefer to type it so I can explain what we need here for those who didn't attend yesterday. So for use query, we're just gonna pass the document or the query that we want to execute. Then we pass it the variables that we want it to be executed with, and we only have an ID variable that we want to pass. Now, the ID variable is, you can grab it in multitude of ways. So routed params.id maybe that's one way you can do it. It's not wrong, but it says, well, it's kind of implicit, right? So that's one way you can do it. You grab the ID, maybe you can set a fetch policy to make sure caching doesn't hit us. And we can grab various things out of the use query composable. For example, the loading, whether it's still loading or not, the result, right? So we can call that task result or the task data or whatever you want to call it, right? And then we just need to expose that task result to the template in a nice way, because again, the graphical results can contain nulls, so we want to clean the data up so we can use it easily in the templates. So the task will be a computed property, and we will access the task result value. This is the reactive value, so you must use dot value, but the data can be null. That's because how GraphQL works. The data can be null if we did something wrong, so we need to be careful about that. So now that we are safe from accessing a null data, we access the task, or if the entire path doesn't exist, just make sure it's null, and that's our task. Now, you might be inclined to do this, right? But this is a little bit dangerous because task can be null for a short while, at least until the data is fetched. So let's just bring back our VF that we had before. If there is a task, show it. And yeah, that's, so basically what we expect right now is just to display the task title once we on the modal title dialog, right? So click, delay it a little bit. Okay, I might have done something wrong. So let me check that. Let me check our queries again. So we get the task. Okay, and we access the value dot task, right? And we have passed the ID. Right. Now, this is something that I actually fill in this a lot of times, but because our board ID is called ID, but our task ID is called task ID, right? This might be it, and it seems like it. So yes, seems to be working fine. Yeah, so that was the problem. The problem was I was using ID, but that refers to the board ID. Instead, I should use the task ID. Now, ideally, I don't like to keep things a little bit ambiguous like this. Maybe we can change the route parameter ID to board ID to make sure it's clear for everyone that this is the board ID. Don't try to use it otherwise. But for now, this is good enough. Now let's display some other stuff, right? We only have nothing really here. So we can begin by maybe displaying the description, right? For the description and titles, right? And we want them to be editable. So we're kind of going to build some kind of a form here. So let's start doing that, and let's check the Kendo UI again to grab these components since we are already using them. So we are interested in inputs, and they sure enough have an input section. And we are interested in the input component, and we can just check the overview. and the source. And again, we're going to import this and make sure you have this package installed. If you don't, I think you already do, since you already used it in a few other components, but just, yeah. So again, rename it to k-input, and now we have our inputs. Now let's create the wrapper for the modal content. So let's just start off with a div. I'm not sure yet what classes to give it, but we will give it a few classes for sure. Let's have a couple of inputs. So, right, and first input is here. This should be the title, and let's give it a label. I know this is not accessible, but again, we are short on time. So let's just make sure to type the labels as quickly as possible. So, because I believe they don't have a label property on their input components, you have to wrap it within a field component. So I don't want to complicate things right now. Okay, so let's just go with text gray 600, text small, font medium. I have no idea if that looks good or not. Just, I think it might, but yeah. And another one for the description. So we are just prototyping. We aren't doing anything functional yet. Let's go back, and sure enough, we have our inputs here. Now, this doesn't look particularly good because we want something a little bit more involved, right? I think you're already bored with just having inputs around. So let's grab since we fetched the due at field, let's add a calendar for it. And they have a date input section, right, separate from the input section, and there is a calendar component, and there is an input picker, but date picker, sorry, or date picker input. But there is a subtle difference. The calendar displays the calendar directly, while the other one is hidden within a menu. So we need this one, not the other one. But it's up to you. Again, make sure this package is installed. If it's not, check the Kendo UI documentation and make sure that you install it before you use it. Then we have the K calendar component ready, so we can just throw it in. It definitely won't look good, but let's see how everything goes. It will reload because Vite has detected a new dependency that was just added, so it has to reload to be able to load it. Right, and this is what we have. Now, this doesn't look half bad, but it's not good either. So let's clean it up a little bit. Then you already shared the screenshot, so let's make it as close as possible to that. So we can start off by thinking it up in maybe grids. That's easier for me at least. So maybe we have 3 columns in that grid. These are tailwind classes. Feel free, if you prefer to use flex, use flex. It doesn't really matter. So yeah, so we want 3 columns, and we want the gap to be maybe 4, so that's 16 pixel, I think. Then we want to make sure that the inputs are on their own columns, so they have the call span 2, and they will span 2/3, right? And the K calendar will take its own third. So if I do this, it looks like this, which is, I would say, miles better, but yeah, a little bit better. Maybe the spacing between the components, between the inputs, isn't that great. So let's just, in case we add more, let's add it on the parent here. 2, let's make it 3. Yeah, I think that works. And yeah, that's pretty much the model. Now let's get back quick. I'm not sure if we have time, but let's quickly hook up some stuff. So so you at least know what to do in your exercise, right? We can do this easily with vmodal. So we can do vmodal equals task.title, but that's a mistake, and you will shortly know why. And another one, task.description, right? And for the calendar, we can just vmodal task.due at. Let's make sure we actually fetch that. Yeah, we did. So yeah, should be all good. And if I go back, notice the data gets filled. So let me close this and open this one. Yes, seems to be working. Your tasks may not have description yet, but because I had to play around a little bit before the session, so I might have some descriptions before you guys. Yeah, but it's the same thing basically. Now, the mistake here is, again, if I try to edit this, I'm gonna be screamed at in the console, right? Because I'm trying to edit something that is read-only, but you might be confused what's read-only about this. And this is it. This is a computed property. You can just change its things because it will just revert back whenever the view renders. Although it seems to work, but it won't really work. So you need to make sure that we change how this works. Now, there are multiple ways to do this, but it seems like we need some sort of a copy of this data that we can edit safely, right? So instead of having a computed property, maybe we should have a ref that's nullable, that's ready to be changed by us at any moment, right? So this is a simple ref, but let's make sure to type it. So it can be null, or it can be an object containing an ID, which is a string, title, which is a string, description. I think it's a nullable string, so string or null. Again, you should go back to the schema, make sure that's correct. Then we have UAT, which is also null, or it can be something else. So what's that something else? If we check the task object, right, and we check the UAT, which is a date, it says it's a scalar, so it's a custom type, right? And this type, according to its description, emits dates or presents dates in this format: year, month, and day. So to TypeScript, that's actually just a string, right? But we can do better. We can make it a date, and you'll know why shortly. So, okay, now we have this. We just wrote the definitions. This isn't any kind of logic. This is just a definition. Now we have an issue of updating this task object whenever the query has fetched, right? So there is a handler that we can grab off useQuery called onResult, and we can rename it to onTask loaded, so it makes more sense. So this will fire whatever callback we give it whenever the data has been resolved. You can also watch the task result using the Vue.js watchers. It's up to you, but this is much easier, and it's a little bit explicit. So onTask loaded gets access to a result, right? And this result should be the same thing as we did in the computed property. So let's first check if there is a result or not. So result.data can be null. So if there isn't a task, just skip. Actually, just set the task to null. But if there is a task, then we need to set it. So task.value equals the result.data.task. And again, this is another mistake because this is reactive data coming up from useQuery. So we need to make sure to be able to clone that properly. So you might be saying, okay, we can do this, but that's not quite correct either because this is shallow cloning. It will not work for the deeply nested arrays and objects. And again, I'm not saying that there will be an issue if you do this or if you just do this, but I generally face issues when messing up the reactivity by not correctly assigning values. So we want to clone this properly, but we can do this quickly with json.parse and json.stringify. Now, this is a trick. Not sure if it's a dirty trick or not, but it's a trick that you can use to clone stuff and clean it up. So this will produce a clean cloned object for you. This can be a performance issue if you have like a huge amount of data, but in our use case, this is good enough. Otherwise, you can grab another library that does the cloning quickly for you, like Lodash or Deep Clone Fast, I think. Both are really good. Now, So this seems all right. Again, there is still an issue, but let's see if everything still works or not. Yeah, sorry. So it seems to be working, right? Yeah, okay. And it's working correctly, but the issue is the date. The date itself, while it's null, we are not handling it correctly because when you are dealing with inputs, component inputs from any component library, not just Kendo, you need to check what kind of input do they accept. So let's check their API reference of the calendar component, because it can, for dates in particular, it can be confusing. So we have the value prop here, which I assume is same as the model value prop, if it even exists, but it can accept either null or a data object. So, but our API emits either string or null, so that's not quite correct for it. So this is actually going to produce a lot of problems for the date calendar components. So we need to fix that quickly. So directly cloning it isn't ideal. Let's just go the old-fashioned way by grabbing the task data. Right, so let's just make sure it looks like this, extract this out so we can quickly refer to it. If there isn't a data, we're still going to set it to null. Otherwise, its ID is the DE, title is data.title. Description is the data.description. And you might be wondering why I did that. Why didn't just I modify the due at value? Just a preference. You can really do pretty much what you want. So for the due at, if there is a due at on the object that we received, then we need to do something next. Otherwise, it's null. Now, what we want to do is parse the date from whatever string format that they have given us from the API to a format that the calendar component understands, which is a data object. So we need some sort of a parse date function. And luckily we do in Kendo UI. It gives us access to a utility function called parse date, and I found this by chance, really. But you can import any other library that parses dates and handle that. So we're going to parse the due at date. I'm going to pass the format. And the format would be, I think it was year, month, and day. Now, for the exact values of these, you can always check the documentation, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. Yeah, now in our example, nothing will actually change because our tasks don't have dates, so we won't actually notice if we did something wrong or incorrect. But basically, this is the modal component in a nutshell. Now, what we want to do is propagate the updates that we do on this component to the API. But first, let me show you something quickly here. So notice that when I change this, this also changes. Maybe you don't want that, maybe you do. Again, I personally think that might be a little bit confusing because if they click close, maybe they think it already persisted. So maybe we shouldn't bind to that and should bind to something else entirely.
Hello, Abdelrahman.
Wait, am I running out of time, right?
Yeah, I think we are a little bit running out of time, but yeah, take your time if you'd like to have like a couple of minutes more to wrap it up. It's okay.
Yeah, just a minute, just this part. I don't think I will be able to do the persisting part, but yeah.
I'll be back.
Okay, so we have the task result, and we can grab the title directly, right? And problem is it can be null, so we need to make sure that the task result is, we make sure it's accessed correctly. Also, the task result is the query result, it's not the task object. So we also need to make sure that we access the task as well, right? And if it's also not nullable, so something like this. Now, when I update this, this shouldn't update and should remain fine. Now, since I got a warning, I think I'm out of time, but I really hope to be able to do the update task functionality, but that's up to you guys.
I think that was awesome, Abdurrahman. Thank you very much for contributing to this hackathon. You did a great job. I think you have done it earlier as well, but you keep optimizing it to make it more elegant and more easy to people, and cleaning up. So thank you very much for that. We do have some questions to you from the audience. Would you like to answer
Sure.
them? Right. I'm super excited about this. So let's start with the obvious one. What is the status of vee-validate, and why might I consider using vee-validate as a form validation solution for my next project?
Okay, so this isn't related to the whatever we did here, but
Yeah, it's different, but
so
since you're
yeah,
here.
yeah, I guess. So the status of vee-validate, I guess it's stable for Vue 3. You can use it if you want to, and why you might consider vee-validate, again, it depends on your use case. If you are using a component library like Kendo or like Vuetify, they already have their own validation logic built in, so maybe you shouldn't use vee-validate with them, but you can still, if you really like vee-validate, you can still can. So it's not really a restriction. If you are building your own component library internally in your project, you should definitely use vee-validate. It makes everything easier for you in terms of data collection, validation, and handling form submissions in general. So I would recommend that.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
Yeah, so it depends always on what you're using alongside with vee-validate.
The age-old answer, I guess. Depends.
Yeah, right. Thanks. So our next question is, what's your preferred way for working with Vue.js? Is it composition API or options, and why?
Okay, it's definitely the composition API. We actually, in Rasail, company I'm working for at the moment, we strictly use the composition API. We don't actually allow people to write the options API into the code base. And for a few reasons. First, there is like this huge flexibility that comes from the composition API. And we don't want to give that up if we want to use the options API. For example, passing reactive references around is a must have for our application and for a lot of applications, really. And I think once you go with the composition API, and if you really appreciate what it's trying to do and the whole flexibility and reusability it offers, that's like on another magnitude than the components options API. I think you would appreciate it then.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you watched this keynote in the morning or a Q&A with even you in the morning. We asked him the same question, and yeah, he answered the very diplomatic way, saying that was the composition API. Actually, it comes with a lot of flexibility, as you said, but it might be a mess if you're working with a team with less experience. So my question to you, as a follow up for this, is how you enforce the code style or the code. I would say code smell for all the components, since different people are working and you might have some juniors or some people are new to Vue.js. So how you enforce it with composition API as well?
Okay, so maybe something that should be mentioned is I personally think you shouldn't use the composition API unless you are using TypeScript. You have to use TypeScript with the composition API. That's step one of enforcing everybody's on the same page, because when you pass these reactive references around, you need TypeScript to tell you, hey, you forgot that dot value. Hey, this is not good to watch, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
One more thing is conventions, right? So we have this written conventions, maybe a guidebook, a README, any kind of form of documentation that tells people to. We have this folder structure where there is some folder called features, for example, and that features contain purely composition API functions. And that's the main way to build your features. Components use these features. So that makes sure that components don't grow out of control and keeps you in context of just TypeScript code without any kind of template. So you kind of can think about how to optimize this, how to make sure it's readable, maintainable, and so on. So it's not really hard methods to enforce this, but we try to do it.
Yeah, it might be just time consuming with code base, code reviews, and every time you're adding until the team, get onboarded in the new way if it's a new for them.
Yeah.
But it's a great answer. Thanks for that. So the next question is not related as well to the session, but related to your niche. Do you have any tips for working with rich text, forms, components? So yeah, give it
Okay,
a head.
so Kendo UI has already one that you guys I think will use called the editor text editor thing, which is a
Mhm.
WYSIWYG component. Um, Now, for the tips in general, again, it depends on what kind of content are you trying to write. Are you trying to write in Markdown or are you trying to write in pure HTML? There are a lot of new UI editors out there. So Kendo UI definitely has one. I think most libraries, component libraries, have one. There is a really one that I like for in the Vue.js ecosystem called TipTap. Maybe
Mhm.
I maybe I misnamed it. I can't remember, but I think it's something like that. I really like that one because it's really flexible. But again, depends on your WYSIWYG component of choice and whether it does what you want it to do or not, or whether it's stylable enough for your project or not. So that's are the things to look at, I guess.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks for answering that. I think there is some people are greeting you in the chat and asking you questions. So please feel free to go ahead and check the chat and see all the people who are greeting you, answer the questions. Because of sake of time, we cannot pick all the questions into the session. Thank you very much again for being here, Abdurrahman. It was a pleasure
Thank you
having
for
you.
having
It
me.
was a pleasure talking to you as well.
Thank you.